Well, good afternoon. On March 15 of 2019, a terrorist attack on Christchurch mosques, as we know, took the lives of 51 people, including innocent children who were peacefully going about their lives in accordance with their religious faith. Dozens more were directly harmed and traumatised, and the ongoing impact of this attack on New Zealand, and in particular on our Muslim community, is immense. In response, the government established a Royal Commission of Inquiry to look into the events around the Terrorist Act. Recommendation 18 of the Royal Commission report was to review all legislation related to counter-terrorism efforts. The counter-terrorism legislation bill being introduced today is the first important step in implementing Recommendation 18. The Royal Commission also highlighted the need for offences to cover the preparatory steps a terrorist might take before they attempt a terrorist act, and other jurisdictions, including Australia and the United Kingdom, have offences of this nature, but there is a gap in New Zealand law, and this bill creates offences to close that gap. The nature of terrorism has been changing, and we are seeing more lone actors and small groups rather than large organised terrorist groups, and we need to ensure New Zealand has laws that can respond to such change. Counter-terrorism legislation, particularly the Terrorism Suppression Act, focuses on managing prominent terrorist groups, and it was not designed to respond to the range of terrorist activity that we now see. The Counter-Terrorism Legislation Bill amends the Terrorism Suppression Act and the Terrorism Suppression Control Orders Act to strengthen our counter-terrorism legislative framework, and the bill will help us prevent and respond to terrorism and provide law enforcement agencies with clear legal authority to disrupt terrorism-related activity. Open to questions.
Any of these changes, if they've been implemented prior to March 15th, would any of these changes have prevented the attack?
I think in terms of legislation, I don't think that would have been able to prevent an attack. I think what they do give authorities now is more tools to make sure if they are able to monitor and see preparations or attempts, they have more tools available for them to take action.
Can you explain the difference or the changes to the definition of the Terrorist Act?
Yes, so look, in terms of that, it is quite technical. So I think the more significant issues really is making sure that we do have measures against preparation for some of these acts. I think certainly the Royal Commission had asked for that. So making sure that we give those tools to the authorities. We hope we'll give them, if they are in the early stages of seeing preparation, the ability to act.
How does the government adjust and keep with the times for terrorism activity? Because as you say, we weren't prepared for these lone actors, but how do we remain fluid so that we can get ahead of whatever the next groups are?
Look, I think changing the legislation to make sure it is broad and flexible is important. I do think we have some flexibility within this piece of legislation. Again, if it's acts of preparation or at the other end carrying out an act. Again, it is making sure that other work that was flagged back in December last year when the Royal Commission came back with its recommendations, and some of the honesty that we had to deal with that in terms of the ways that the likes of our police and our intelligence agencies are working to making sure they're not focused on one particular area is important. Again, that was one of the important findings out of the Royal Commission, and again I think we are systematically working our way through those to make sure that we are responsive to both what we consider kind of traditional terrorism threats and more recent terrorism threats.
Are you confident this plugs the gap?
Look, I think it does, and there are other changes that we'll look at in terms of financing that again came out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry, but you know there is a systematic response to the recommendations that were given out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry around the counter-terrorism out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry around counter-terrorism that we will have to make sure that we work through.
Is it right that a lot of these changes are still kind of determined by the entities that are on the designated terrorist entity list? And if that's the case, how many white supremacist organisations or individuals are on that list?
Look, my understanding is there is only one individual who is on the list. The way that this legislation is designed is it's agnostic to either the individual or the entity. So if they are undertaking action which is of an ideological, political or religious nature to carry out harm or cause harm to people or to critical infrastructure, then they would find themselves in trouble of contravention of the law that we hope to pass. So I'm much going to RNZ at the back.
The changes to the definition of the Terrorist Act, would that make it easier for white supremacist or far-right groups to be added or designated as a specific terrorist?
Look, it's not necessarily about the designation of the list. I think it is if they are trying to use harm to advance their ideological, political or religious cause, then they will find themselves in contravention of the law as we want to pass.
It is though, isn't it? Because it talks about making property material support available and financing stuff it still relates to designated terrorist entities. So if you don't have those white supremacist entities on the designated list, then they're not going to apply.
But as I repeat, if they are contravening, if they are trying to advance their cause and they're trying to harm an individual or a group of people to advance either their ideological, their political or their religious causes, then they will find themselves in contravention of the bill we hope to pass.
There's currently no mention of the far-right white supremacy in the Terrorism Suppression Act, but there are multiple mentions of Al-Qaeda and the threat that Islamic State presents. Is that going to be changing? Will we see?
Look, I think, as I say, there's another swathe of work that will continue to go through in a progress way in response to the Royal Commission of Inquiry. The bill that we have announced today looks at making sure we strengthen the measures that we can take around domestic terrorism, which, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, became more of a threat to New Zealanders.
Similar to Tova's opening question, not what prevented the attack, but which of the new offences would apply to the March 15 terrorists that were in place now?
So can you repeat that question?
Which of the new offences you're bringing in would apply to the March 15 terrorists?
Okay, again, I don't want to get into details around a specific case, but if the police were able to monitor preparation for a terrorist attack, then the measures that are contained within this bill would have allowed them to take action and potentially prosecute an individual.
But it's fair to say, though, that the new offence to criminalise plannings, criminalise terrorist weapons, new offence to carrying out international travel, all those things he would of course have been charged with.
Well, again, not getting into particular parts of a particular case, if the police were able to monitor some of the activities that are within this bill, then they could have taken action. Again, they weren't able to do that because the bill is, we hope the bill to be passed.
Would the travelling producers who have been printed?
With the current law, then, if they found an individual who was planning a terrorist attack, would they not be able to undertake those safety measures?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
You're basically saying with the new bill, the police can take action against an individual. Can they not do that?
Well, I think if you look at the way that the offences are framed, it is against either an individual or group to advance their ideological, political or religious cause. So that is the new measure within the piece of legislation, which is new, which would allow us to tackle some of the new types of terrorism that we're seeing.
Sure, but sorry, you answered my question.
Because it is tied to the ideological, political and religious causes of the either individual or entity.
Yeah, but I'm asking about what the current law is. Does the current law not allow us to do that?
That is my opinion. That is my understanding.
And what about the warrantless powers of entry, search and surveillance for that planning and preparation?
Yeah.
Enough checks and balances in place to ensure that won't be abused?
Yeah, look, I think we have to make sure that, especially with planning and preparation, our authorities need to make sure that they have the ability to be nimble in those situations. So we do believe that there are safeguards, but I think importantly, if they believe a situation is in preparation and close to becoming an attempt or an act, then they need the ability to act.
So we can end up with another 2 Hoi raids?
Well, I would hope not. I think hopefully we would have learnt from that lesson. But again, I think we need to be mindful of how terrorism threats have evolved over time and making sure that our authorities have the ability to act if they see
Back
fit.
to Derek's question, can you just clarify what? So if they can, if this passes the warrantless powers of entry search for the preparation or whatever, What can they do now, or what can't they do now that this will?
I don't believe that they have warrantless powers at the moment to undertake that act if there's a preparation. So that's why within this piece of legislation it's extremely important that we do give the authorities, if they see preparation which is close to becoming an attempt or an act, the ability to intercept, to prevent an act happening.
What does that look like? Like, what's the threshold? Someone's buying with a gun, someone's on 4chan a lot, like
Well, there are a number of possibilities. If you look at the way that there is financing, there is training, there is the within the piece of legislation in front of us, there's also the likes of training and obtaining of weapons. So that would be a judgment for the authorities to make. But if they believe that we've got all those factors coming together, then within this bill there is the ability for them to go for the warrantless powers.
Richard Carrot wouldn't necessarily have been flagged by any of those things, though, would it?
Which is why, again, not getting into individual cases, which is why the bill, as it is, has been introduced.
Getting into individual cases, but that was an individual based on what you
And it's the whole reason you don't.
So I'll go here.
Yeah, have you received any information or anything in your briefings about this that indicate that these charges could have been used in the past 2 years? You know, have you been provided with any case studies by police or any other agencies that indicate that these charges could have been useful?
Look, I'm not going to get into any particular instances, but I believe that it would be rare, and I would hope it would be rare for us to use these powers.
Because we have seen cases of people making terror threats and then being subsequently arrested in the past 2 years. Could these charges have been useful in those cases?
Well, I think the mere fact that the Royal Commission of Inquiry has asked for this to happen, and as I identified in my opening remarks, that there is a gap within the system around those who are preparing at the moment, and which is why we've introduced the bill.
And how do you balance the concerns that now that you're opening up prosecution of predatory offences, that the Islamic community, the Muslim community, won't be adversely scrutinised and prosecuted as a result of the expansion of these powers?
Look, I think there are a number of things there. I think at the time, both the Prime Minister and the Commissioner of Police apologised for what led to the attack on March 15. Intelligence agencies have also taken on board the fact that their focus on one particular community was not the right approach to take. So I think making sure that the culture and the legislation in the counter-terrorism space is changed, and that is a work over time, piece of work over time that must be done in order for the kinds of concerns that a particular community might have.
Can you give us a specific commitment that this won't entrench that disproportionate focus on the Muslim?
Yeah, which is why I think there have been a couple of lines of questioning which I've kept very broad. If we are looking at ideological, political or religious causes being advanced, that is the frame for the legislation as proposed. I think we've taken the recommendations and the spirit of the recommendations for the Royal Commission of Inquiry extremely seriously. I've been down and spoken to the Muslim community down in Christchurch on a number of occasions and have experienced and heard firsthand their hurt. So we have heard, we have listened, and we've committed to making sure we implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission.
Was this clunky law on the government's radar pre-March 15?
Yes, it was, but obviously March 15 was a game changer, and I think the message that we got in early December last year from both the community down in Christchurch and also from the Royal Commission was extremely important. I know we're in early April now, and the message was received from the Royal Commission in early December last year. So it's been a priority for us to get the scope of this work around counter-terrorism through.
Canada, the United Kingdom and Australia.
Yeah.
Canada, the United Kingdom and Australia have all designated the Atom Waffen Division or its offshoots as their equivalent of a designated terrorist entity. The Prime Minister and Minister Little both said we can't do that here because our law is too restrictive. Will this enable us to label that group? And if not, why would we not want to put our regime in line with others? So
this piece of legislation very clearly deals with making sure we can take the preventative measures that I've spoken about around terrorism that's happening here. Around designation of terrorist entities is not a substantive issue within this bill.
I suppose
Apologies
it's just a
if you've
concern.
covered it, but
Yeah.
can you just talk us through the definition? And if you hear we don't need to again, particularly the change from the word strike, like terror in the community, to fear. Like, what's the difference, and what difference will that make to how things apply?
Well, I think if you look at what the feedback that came from the community in and around the March 15 attack, some of the language in and around what the definition of a terrorist attack is outdated in terms of the types of actions that can be taken for terrorism. I think another aspect of the piece of legislation that we've got within this bill is also around critical infrastructure. Terrorism is moving in the ways that where it might have been an act of violence or trying to harm people, it's also looking at disrupting critical infrastructure. So again, it is making sure that we modernise that and take into account the changing nature of terrorism, not just here in New Zealand, but around the world.
Isn't that definition, though, like going from terror to fear, going into quite a different area, because fear could be like acts of intimidation, like what we saw at the mosque, for example, which you could argue whether they're a terrorist attack. Is it meant to broaden the offences or the actions that would be covered? Because then aren't you getting away from a very specific terrorist?
I wouldn't say broaden. I think it is bringing it into line again, and I want to reiterate of what terrorism is looking like, not just here in New Zealand, but also around the world. It has to be drawn back to an act, but what is the intent of the act also? So yes, the definition is being amended, but I think it is being amended in light of what terrorism has been and is becoming.
Like what campaign, for example, against a group, as opposed to a specific like pipe bomb attack, which you normally see as what could have been called in the past, to like a campaign of fear and harassment. Is that sort of? There
always has to be an act, and again, the act has to be motivated by some I'm saying like a scratch record, ideological, political, or advancement of a religious cause. So again, it is, terrorism is much different today than what it was back in the era of 9/11. So the legislation has to change for that. So.
It doesn't always have to be an act that's sanctioned in law, because if someone's getting weapons or combat training, the prosecutor doesn't have to prove that they have a specific date.
Well, I would argue either helping to give weapons training or obtaining weapons is an act.
Where are the changes to hate speech laws?
They're still being developed. That is going to be a longer piece of work, because we think we know we have to make sure that we're engaging with nearly every facet of community to understand where that line might be drawn. Again, it's an important piece of work at the back of the Royal Commission, but that is on a much longer time frame than this piece of legislation.
Following from James.
Sorry, much go.
Will this coincide with Sahara Aiden returning? Will this be in place to be able to deal with her?
Look, I'm not going to comment on individual cases. I have been asked about whether the current control orders regime is suitable for the situations that we may have in the future, and I do believe it is.
So it'll be in time to...
No, what I'm saying is the current control regime order, which pertains to people who have been convicted of terrorism acts overseas, we believe is fit for purpose if we were needed to be called on those in the future.
But just to clarify, because she hasn't come back to New Zealand yet, if this is passed soon, could that apply to her or not?
So the current control orders regime within the Terrorism Suppression Control Orders Act pertains to people who are coming in from overseas. The changes within this piece of legislation pertain to people who have been convicted and imprisoned of terrorism offences here in New Zealand. So it does not apply to people who have been convicted and imprisoned overseas.
Just going on from James' questions around the new definition, inducing fear is much wider than inducing terror. Would something like a prank bomb scare then qualify under this act?
So at the end of the day, that would be a call for the police to make whether or not that would be a threshold that is met if there is serious intent behind that. So that is a judgment for the police to make.
Concerns in general that this is too wide?
No, I don't. And again, this is why we'll send it to the Select Committee for a full process to put those to the test. But we do believe that given what has happened out of the Royal Commission and other changing trends with terrorism, that the bill as it stands is fit for what we think the future threats might be.
Something like leaving a pig's head at a mosque non-violently, would that count as?
Well, I'm not going to get into individual cases again. All of those issues will be able to be dealt with or questioned at a select committee, but we do believe that, again, out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry process and the recommendations from it, which we committed in principle to address, we believe the components of this legislation will make sure our counter-terrorism legislation is fit for purpose.
There's only one white supremacist individual on the designated terrorist entity, and Katie's point that Daesh and Al-Qaeda are mentioned in the legislation, but white supremacy is not. What assurance can you give the Muslim community that this won't entrench that disproportionate focus on them, that it won't make it worse for the Muslim community?
Look, I can give them absolute assurance that we listened very closely and are sympathetic to the experience post March 15. We took very seriously the Royal Commission of Inquiry that was delivered early in December of last year, and we are committed to making sure we systematically address the recommendations that are within the report. This is one component of that, and again I would add that not only are we looking at making the changes that the Royal Commission recommended, after having spoken to those communities and understanding the way that they felt both pre and post March 15, that the government heard their concerns and changes are being made.
So just back to that pig's head and the mosque example, because it feels like that's a perfect example to test, fear versus terror. Do you want that to be covered by these new offences?
Well, I'm not going to sit here and go through every possible permutation of what may or may not be. That particular instance may or may not be raised at a select committee, but we know that the settings need to change, and I don't know where it may come from. It may come from the members of the public. They will get the chance to test those kinds of issues at a select committee, and we will listen.
What do you hope that is covered or not? I mean, you've got to have a goal when setting this legislation, right?
Well, our goal is to prevent serious harm to the communities who feel that that prior to the Royal Commission of Inquiry, they did not have the protections.
That would appear to be a prima facie case that under this bill, would it not? If you were a Muslim and...
Well, it may or may not, and people will have the ability to test those cases through the select committee.
How do they test it in the select committee process?
Well, they can put that forward as a potential situation, and the select committee will give their opinion as to whether or not that should or should not meet the threshold.
Is this the biggest loophole as well? Is this the biggest loophole?
When you're saying that you're talking Muslim community and this, this change had in part come from that, can you just explain their perspective, the difference between having fear versus terror? Like, why was that relevant? And, how would that help you?
I think they had that issue before, again, pre and post March 15. Look, obviously, post March 15, the fear was there and continued to linger. So I think when you look at that and other issues that were raised in the Royal Commission of Inquiry, and again the changing nature of the way that terrorism is being carried out, again modernising components of our counter-terrorism law and the definition were important to make sure it is fit for purpose in the future.
The Royal Commission also recommended that hate crime legislation be tweaked to sort of perhaps be in line with what happens in the UK, where you can be charged with hate-motivated offences and it's not just something that's taken into account in sentencing. How's that work coming along? Is that something that the government...
Look, again, in response to an earlier question, that is a piece of work that we're committed to. It's a longer-term piece of work. We want to make sure that we engage with the wider community and, importantly, across political parties for that kind of work too. It is controversial areas, and we want to make sure that if we do that, we are talking to other political parties about what kind of direction we might head in.
And this part about the critical infrastructure, does that, without getting into specific cases, but looking at I'll get into a specific case. Looking at things like, 5G attacks on cell tower infrastructure motivated by sort of anti-5G sentiment. Is that what you're thinking of when you...
Look, I think critical infrastructure, again, making sure we are broadening the scope of this work to take into account the different types of terrorism that may happen is extremely important. We have seen attacks on infrastructure. I think thankfully not critical infrastructure, but making sure that we are ready for the possibility of that, because we've seen evidence of it in other jurisdictions is important to have in this piece of legislation.
Financing terrorism changes, would they have captured the Brent and Terrence donations to those far-right organisations or not?
Look, I'm not sure about that particular part of the donations that he gave. I'm not privy to every point within that case. But again, that is making sure that we crack down on any ability for an entity to either prepare or attempt or carry out some kind of attack. Sorry.
In terms of support from other parties, have you ever had any indication of this amendment, the bill will be
this particular piece of legislation? No, I haven't had any discussions with any...
So has been fraught in the past amending this legislation?
Well, I don't think this particular component of the Royal Commission of Inquiry will be fraud. I think other parts around hate speech, hate crimes will probably be more politically difficult to broach some kind of agreement with other political parties. So, but we'll deal with that issue when we get to it.
So you're expecting support from the likes of the National Party and the Greens on this?
As I say, I haven't spoken to them about it. So that is up to their own caucuses as to whether or not they're supported or not.
So this is the first step in implementing Recommendation 18. When do you kind of anticipate that you would have reviewed all of the counter-terrorism laws and that recommendation could be taken on?
Look, I think when we're talking about hate speech and hate crimes, again, I've already indicated that will be a much longer track. I think it's well into next year where I think we'll be able to address some of those concerns. But again, I'll reiterate, it's fraught, but we want to make sure that we do a proper job of that, considering the recommendations of the Royal Commission.
We're working on it for 3 years. You were working on it last term. Prime Minister promised it again on the election campaign.
Look, so again, some of these recommendations have come out of, some of these actions have come out of recommendations that came from the Royal Commission in December last year. I think making sure we have these changes in this legislation is important, and that's been 4 months. But again, if we are dealing with issues like hate crime and hate speech, making sure we do it properly is extremely important to make sure that we are putting the protections in there for the communities who you've been speaking about already this afternoon.
What about any further changes to the Terrorism Suppression Act? When will you be?
Again, I think that will be later in the term.
Is this the biggest overhaul of our counter-terrorism laws or 2012 laws?
Look, I wouldn't be as arrogant to claim that, but I think it's significant given the recommendations out of the Royal Commission. They are substantive in the fact that we now have the ability to criminalise the likes of travelling overseas to carry out a terrorism act, but importantly making sure that those who are preparing or training or getting weapons for terrorism acts here in New Zealand can be prosecuted for that.
I understand a proposal to accede to the Budapest Convention was put forward at the same time as this act. What's happening with that? Why hasn't that happened?
That was one of the components out of the Royal Commission that we agreed to do, and I don't think we're too far away from doing that. Cool. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.